I'm going to spend probably 15 to 20 minutes or so to share what we've been hearing about in terms of ambient voice technology from the field, from NHS trusts who are deploying it at present, also from primary care, and some of the discussions that we've had with system leaders, including the RCGP presentations at the Joint GP-IT Committee, and also sort of asking at the end for your sort of steer and feedback in terms of what we feel our response should be to some of the concerns that have been raised by the system with regards to AVT. AVT is essentially software that listens to a clinical consultation and it automatically generates some structured documentation. We know that this is here now. It's not a future prospects. It's been deployed right across primary care and secondary care through individual supplier contracts in the main, often without some of the necessary safeguards in place, common standards or robust governance frameworks being put into place. What we're seeing is that every organization is independently working through some of the same questions. How do we train staff? How does this integrate with our EPR? What happens if the system goes down? You know, how do we continue to make sure the clinical record remains accurate and safe after introduction of AVT? And the four concerns on the right side of this slide are what we have been consistently hearing. AI, so it's the first one around record quality. AI generated text is sort of replacing the concise narrative that clinicians have sort of curated over long periods of time. So especially my background as a GP, this really matters quite significantly, especially when you see the patient for the second, third, fourth, fifth times. We quite heavily, certainly in general practice, rely on ensuring that the notes trigger particular schemas and our ability to recall the particular nuance, the clinical reasoning, the thinking at the time, the clinical reasoning behind a particular decision. And there are some concerns now that AI-generated text isn't having that effect on clinicians, and actually clinicians are failing to recognise their own documented text following clinical encounters, especially on subsequent encounters with that same patient. Clinical accountability, so clarifying who's responsible when AI generates content that's inaccurate. Coding and interoperability, if structured SNOMED coding is lost to free text, but also the downstream value of the clinical record when this happens in terms of interoperability. And lastly, patient safety. So AI summarization without any robust clinical safety frameworks can carry real risks. There is obviously the national frameworks, the DCBA 160, 129, etc. But this is sort of looking beyond that in terms of implications for workflow, for example, which I'll come on to in a minute. So we're hearing these concerns playing out at various implementation sites. And as Oliver mentioned, we're working with South West London ICB, where NHS trusts in the area are in live deployment with an AVT called Lyra Bird Health. And some of the challenges that are being encountered are fairly consistent across all of the trusts within the area. But the solutions, even with sort of our encounters we've come across are quite varied and disparate across the trusts. So, I mean, it's quite clear that localization has a role. Each trust has a specific way of doing things, but too much localization, it's quite clear that there's quite significant inefficiencies and duplication of effort over sort of a more centralized approach. So there needs to be that correct balance. There's no single model that works across care settings. Trusts want sort of shared core material, but all of this material needs to be localized depending on how they work. And some of the challenges that they're talking about obviously is with the new intake in August of junior doctors, it creates real-time pressures on how to get this training sort of rolled out to the new cohorts of staff, and on inductions, and time pressures on inductions as well. In terms of workflow and EPR integration, this is, I think, been described as probably the hardest problem. Many departments or specialties have over time developed bespoke templates, bespoke documentation habits, and there's also quite significant variation in what certain departments would want sort of flat AI transcription to be used, as opposed to AI summarization. So arguably, perhaps in the EPR, you may want summarization, but some clinicians are still wedded to ensuring that there is an accurate transcription when they are dictating clinical letters, for example, to primary care. So on governance, certainly in Southwest London, the ICB has done some heavy lifting on the DPIA centrally, and the plans on business continuity are developing. Trust is still working out, how critical AVT is, and what should happen when it fails. In terms of evaluation, self-reported admin time studies are underway, and there's some good work happening with the health innovation networks in this space as well, supporting the team. But I guess the key insight that I wanted to draw out here is that each of the trusts in this one ICB, but actually in the same's the case for other ICBs and nationally, they're navigating the same implementation challenges independently, with some things being done at an ICB level, and some things being done at individual trust levels. But there's very little national guidance to draw on learning from sites that are perhaps further ahead. And certainly that's currently a gap that's being experienced and felt at many sites. We've met with some of the RCGP leadership, and also sort of attended other meetings with RCGP representation, and the BMA at committees like the Joint GP-IT Committee, to really explore what potentially collaboration around AVT might be possible with the system. And three concerns came through consistently with these conversations. And firstly was, as I mentioned earlier, erosion of the clinical narrative. Primary care record, for example, being diluted, years of curated information, concise information being replaced by lengthy AI-generated text that clinicians don't always recognize or trust when they review it later. Secondly, coding and interoperability. So this is where AVT free text replaces Snowbird coded entries. There is a bit of an effort sometimes required to ensure that the right clinical code is identified and selected when you're inputting information into records. And actually, there's sometimes a tendency to just say, actually, the free text covers it, and perhaps a tendency to therefore not necessarily code in the way that you perhaps might do without it. This has all sorts of implications as the coding underpins population health, QoF, clinical decision support, and also interoperability across care settings where that code information is used downstream. Thirdly, it was felt that there's lack of perhaps shouldn't put no independent professional voice, but perhaps that should read lack of a consensus independent professional voice. Professionals have been involved with shaping some of these products out there, but there doesn't necessarily seem to be any sort of consensus in the system. Implementation guidance is shaped by and large by suppliers, and actually our members, RCGP included, have indicated that they see PRSB as a trusted neutral channel through which clinical concerns that their members have can be raised constructively with system suppliers, and also senior decision makers across the system. Okay, so what is PRSB's response to some of the concerns that I've just highlighted there from the system? So we're proposing to develop an AVT implementation accelerator. And I put there, essentially, that's a time-bound, sponsor-funded program that brings clinicians, suppliers, and system leaders together to develop best practice and enable safe implementation. And four things define it. So number one is PRSB acting as an independent convener, not dictating the standards, but really facilitating that cross-system consensus in a system or technology agnostic way. The guidance we produce needs to apply to whatever AVT product is being used. Secondly, converting standards into practice. So our BAU, as you're aware, includes translating standards into practice, and we've done increasing work over the years on implementation toolkits, for example. But it's really aligning AVT outputs with existing record standards, SNOMED coding, fire interoperability, as well as actually addressing medical legal status of AI-generated content, which is also important in terms of patient safety. So in terms of sort of the outputs of this, we've tried to keep it practical. So essentially a consensus paper on best practice implementation guidance for NHS organisations, and a supplier reference standard is what we're thinking at present. And I guess important to highlight that we've had this accelerator approach. It's not completely new to us. It's a proven model. We've used it with the work that we've done with A4BC, which is the connected medication management, the work that Oliver referred to earlier that we're doing with Rahul Singhal at NHS England. And we're currently extending it into diabetes devices as well. So we do feel that this model has potential to be successful. And the key is that the outputs are co-produced with the system, not imposed by us or any other organization. So we propose that this accelerator could work in two phases. Phase one would be system roundtables. So that's where we bring together the clinicians from primary care, secondary care, community care, digital leaders, clinical safety officers, suppliers, professional bodies, etc., together. The focus would be on priority clinical use cases. So I've put some of these there, but I'm looking for some feedback on this and whether we've got this right a bit later on. We put at this point GP consultations, long-term condition reviews, outpatient letters, ward rounds, MDTs, and the focus needs to be on verification models, clinical accountability, workflow patterns, safety considerations. And the output of that, as I mentioned earlier, is a consensus paper on best practice. And then phase two would be implementation labs. So working groups that we set up to develop practical guidance. So what should AVT generated notes look like? How should verification work? Where must structured coding override free text output to safeguard the integrity of the record and its uses downstream? The outputs here would be implementation guidance for NHS organisations and a supplier reference standard. And the reason for doing it in this way would be that we build clinical consensus in phase one and then translate it into something practical and usable in phase two for the system. I suppose why us is the legitimate question. And here, PRSB is neither a supplier nor a regulator. We have existing relationships with our members, which are the professional bodies, and suppliers through things like the supplier partnership scheme as well. And actually both parties alike see us as a credible neutral convener. We've got deep standards expertise, SNOMED, CT, fire, clinical record standards, which are the foundations to which we need an AVT to align with. And through the Santander's partnership scheme, we've got established relationships with all the major EPR vendors as well, and also a growing number of AVT suppliers. So again, that stands us in good stead. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got a proven accelerator model as well. So again, that helps. And briefly on the timing issue, we know AVT deployment is not only happening, but it's accelerating, and more sites are implementing AVT. And I think it's really important to pause as to what problem these sites are trying to solve, which was a theme that came out at the Joint GP-IT Committee, and ensuring that actually the reasons for implementation are taken into account, as opposed to simply becoming excited by the new shiny toy that it promises to solve many of the NHS's issues. Standards developed. I guess the other point is that the standards that are developed after widespread adoption will potentially have a need to be retrofitted into systems where poor practice is already embedded, which is a much harder task to do. So again, timing is quite important here. And in terms of the phase 2 workflow that I talked about, workflow integration, that's fast approaching. Once that's woven into EPR workflows, sort of course correction becomes that much more difficult. We've also had signals from member organisations, the RCGP included, about an appetite for coordinated action in this area. NHSE's own maturity framework recognises the need for some sort of implementation guidance to be available, and we need to be mindful that AVT has implications which are far beyond just improving sort of efficiencies within consultations and the likes. It has significant impact on data quality and subsequent impact on clinical safety and patient care, and all of that needs to be taken into account when we're developing frameworks as well. I think at this point I just wanted to pause for your thoughts and feedback. Firstly, I think on scope and clinical priorities. So I mentioned the 6 use cases and I've reproduced them there on the left. This is where we think we should start some of our thinking, but it would be really helpful to understand your thoughts. Have we got these priorities correct? Are there other clinical settings or patient groups that you feel we should prioritize over and above these? Secondly, on stakeholder reach, where in active discussions with the RCGP, for example, about co-leadership of the accelerator, but your thoughts on who else we should be talking to, any professional bodies, patient groups, system partners that you could help connect us with would be, again, really helpful. And thirdly, on governance and PRSB's role, if there are any concerns about how we're positioning this, are there any aspects of the programme you'd want to see strengthened before we formally launch? Any feedback, either now or if you prefer later by email, would be really gratefully received. I'll stop there. Thank you.